when a gang of bikers entered Riverside Diner, their heavy boots echoing against the tiled floor. The hum of conversation in the diner fell silent as every head turned toward the group. They were known in the area for causing trouble wherever they went, but today they were in the mood for more than just loud jokes and dirty looks. Their leader, Mick, scanned the room with a cocky grin, his eyes locking onto a lone woman sitting quietly in the corner booth. She had a calm air about her, dressed in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, her attention seemingly focused on the sandwich in front of her. "Easy target," Mick muttered to his crew with a smirk. They chuckled and followed him as he swaggered toward her booth. The other diners exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to interfere. This gang had a reputation, and no one wanted to be their next victim. Mick stopped in front of the woman's table, planting both hands on the edge of her booth. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said loudly, leaning in so everyone could hear. "You're in my seat." The woman, Jessica Kane, didn't look up immediately. She calmly set her sandwich down, wiped her hands with a napkin, and finally raised her gaze to meet Mick's. Her expression was unreadable, but her piercing eyes froze him for a moment. "There are plenty of empty seats," she said evenly, her voice calm but firm. Mick straightened, his grin faltering for a split second before he recovered. "I wasn't asking," he said, his tone sharpening. Behind him, the rest of the gang chuckled, egging him on. Jessica's eyes flicked to them briefly, then back to Mick. She didn't look nervous, but she didn't look angry either, just calm, unnervingly calm. "I'll say this once," she said, her voice low but carrying across the diner. "Walk away now." Mick blinked, confused for a moment. Then he barked a laugh, looking back at his crew as if to say, "Can you believe this?" "Lady," he said, leaning closer, "I don't know who you think you're talking to, but—" Before he could finish, Jessica moved. In a flash, she grabbed Mick's wrist, twisting it in a way that made him yelp in pain. With one smooth motion, she pulled him forward and slammed his arm onto the table, pinning him there. The diner gasped. Jessica leaned in slightly, her voice still calm but with a cold edge. "I warned you." Mick's crew lurched forward, but Jessica didn't flinch. With a quick shove, she released Mick, sending him stumbling back into his gang. He clutched his wrist, his face red with humiliation. "You're gonna regret that," Mick snarled, his voice shaking with anger. Jessica stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Her eyes met Mick's again, steady and unyielding. "No," she said simply. "You're the one who'll regret it." The gang hesitated, glancing at each other. Something about her calm demeanor made them second-guess themselves. "Let's go," one of them muttered, tugging at Mick's jacket. Mick growled under his breath but didn't argue. With a final glare at Jessica, he turned and stormed out, his crew following reluctantly. The sound of their boots and the slam of the diner door echoed in the stunned silence that followed. Jessica sat back down, picking up her sandwich as if nothing had happened. The other patrons stared, whispers spreading through the room. The waitress approached cautiously, her voice a mix of awe and nervousness. "Are you okay?" Jessica gave her a small nod. "Just fine, thanks." But as she watched the gang ride away through the window, her calm expression tightened. She knew this wasn't over. Men like Mick didn't walk away without retaliation, and when they came back, she'd be ready. The afternoon sun was still high as the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the distance, leaving the Riverside Diner in an uneasy quiet. Jessica Kane finished her sandwich with deliberate calm, though her eyes flicked occasionally to the door. The tension in the room had begun to ease, but the nervous glances from the other patrons lingered. "You really handled them," the waitress said quietly, approaching Jessica's table with a fresh pot of coffee. Her voice carried a mix of admiration and fear. "They're bad news around here, you know. Always causing trouble. No one stands up to them." Jessica gave her a faint smile. "Sometimes standing up is the only choice." The waitress hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the coffee pot. "You should be careful. Mick doesn't let things go. He'll be back." Jessica nodded, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm counting on it." The waitress blinked, unsure of what to say, and walked back behind the counter. Jessica finished her coffee, left a generous tip, and walked out to the parking lot. Her black SUV gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the dust-covered motorcycles that had just left. As she slid into the driver's seat, Jessica's mind was already working through scenarios. She had dealt with men like Mick before, arrogant, entitled, and dangerous when their pride was wounded. They would come back, and they wouldn't be alone. But Jessica wasn't worried. She reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a slim, black case. Inside was a satellite phone. She flipped it open, dialing a number she hadn't used in years. A voice answered after the second ring. "Kane, is that you?" "It's me," Jessica said, her tone even. "I might need some backup, just a precaution." "Where are you?" "Small diner off Highway 16, Jessica replied. "You'll know it when you see it." The voice on the other end hesitated, then said, "I'll put the word out, but are you sure you need it?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smile. "Not yet. Just be ready." She hung up and slid the phone back into the case. For now, she was on her own. Meanwhile, Mick and his crew were tearing down the highway, the roar of their engines drowning out any conversation. But Mick's scowl said more than words could. His injured wrist throbbed, a constant reminder of the humiliation he'd suffered in front of his gang and the entire diner. "Can't believe she did that," muttered Roy, one of the younger bikers. "Did you see how fast she moved?" "Shut up," Mick snapped, his voice sharp enough to silence the group. They pulled into the dusty lot of a decrepit bar on the outskirts of town, their unofficial clubhouse. The interior smelled of stale beer and old leather. Mick slammed the door behind him as he stormed inside, grabbing a bottle from behind the counter and twisting it open with his good hand. "That woman," he growled, pacing back and forth, "thinks she can humiliate me in front of everyone?" "She wasn't normal," muttered Lance, the quietest of the group. "She had training." Mick spun on him. "What are you saying, she's some kind of cop?" "Maybe," Lance replied, his tone cautious. "Or military." "She didn't hesitate, Mick. She was calculating, controlled. That wasn't just some random diner customer." The others exchanged uneasy glances, the reality of Lance's words sinking in. Mick slammed the bottle onto the counter, the glass shattering. "I don't care who she is. No one does that to me and gets away with it." "What's the plan?" one of the bikers asked hesitantly. Mick's grin returned, cruel and full of malice. "We make her pay, tonight." Back at the diner, Jessica stayed parked for a moment, watching the horizon. She could feel the eyes of the remaining customers on her as they left, one by one. It wasn't fear she felt, it was preparation. She drove to the nearest motel and checked into a small, nondescript room. Once inside, she locked the door, pulled the curtains, and opened a concealed compartment in her suitcase. Inside was a standard-issue 9mm pistol, a tactical knife, and a compact first aid kit. Old habits die hard. Jessica inspected the gun, loaded it, and set it on the nightstand. She knew Mick and his crew wouldn't wait long. If they had any sense, they'd try to scare her first. If they didn't, they'd come straight for her. Either way, she was ready. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jessica sat by the window, her back straight, her senses on high alert. Memories of past missions flitted through her mind. Dusty deserts, jungle ambushes, and quiet moments of preparation before the storm. She had faced worse threats than a gang of overconfident bikers. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the contact she'd called earlier. "Backup 30 minutes out. Stay safe." Jessica smiled faintly. She appreciated the gesture, but she didn't need saving. She just needed the odds to stay even. Mick and his crew weren't subtle. As night fell, the roar of motorcycles echoed through the quiet streets near the motel. Jessica's sharp ears picked up the sound before it even reached the parking lot. She moved swiftly, switching off the room's light and positioning herself near the window. The gang pulled in, their headlights cutting through the dark. Mick dismounted, his movements aggressive, his face twisted with anger. "She's here," he growled. The others followed his lead, pulling bats and chains from their bikes. Lance lingered at the back, his expression conflicted. "Are we sure about this?" Lance asked, his voice low. Mick turned on him, his temper flaring. "What? You scared of one woman?" "She's not just a woman," Lance muttered. but Mick wasn't listening. Jessica watched from the shadows as they approached. Her hand rested lightly on the pistol, but she didn't draw it yet. She wanted to see what their plan was. Mick gestured to the others to surround the building, clearly intending to trap her inside. Jessica's eyes narrowed. They were predictable, but that didn't make them less dangerous. Mick stepped closer to the door, his voice loud and mocking. "Hey, lady! Thought you could embarrass me and just walk away?" Jessica didn't answer. "Come on out," Mick continued, rattling the door handle. "Let's have a little chat." Still no response. Mick nodded to one of his men, who raised a bat and swung it at the window. The glass shattered, but as it did, a blinding light flashed from inside. Jessica had activated a small tactical strobe, momentarily disorienting the gang. In the chaos, she moved. The door swung open, and before Mick could react, Jessica stepped out, her posture calm, but her eyes blazing. "Last chance," she said, her voice cutting through the night. "Leave now." Mick recovered quickly, his rage overtaking his caution. "Get her!" he yelled. The first man lunged, swinging his chain, but Jessica sidestepped, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. He cried out as the chain clattered to the ground. In the same motion, she delivered a precise kick to his knee, sending him sprawling. Another came at her with a bat, but Jessica ducked under the swing, landing a sharp elbow to his ribs. He doubled over, gasping. Mick and the others hesitated, their bravado fading as they realized they were outmatched. "You'll regret this," Mick snarled, reaching for a knife at his belt. Before he could act, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. Mick froze, his head whipping toward the sound. Jessica's reinforcements had arrived. She smirked faintly, lowering her stance but keeping her gaze locked on Mick. "You're right," she said. "This isn't over, but it's over for tonight." The gang scattered, their confidence shattered. As they roared off into the night, Jessica stood in the parking lot, her silhouette framed by the flashing lights of approaching patrol cars. This was just the beginning. The chaos of the night lingered in the air as Jessica Kane stood outside the motel, watching the flashing patrol car lights illuminate the dark parking lot. She could still hear the fading roar of the bikers' motorcycles as they sped off into the night, tails tucked between their legs. The first officers on the scene were already moving toward her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of them asked, his flashlight aimed briefly at her face. Jessica gave a small nod, keeping her composure. "I'm fine. No one got hurt." She gestured to the shattered glass and scattered debris. "But they might have caused some damage." The officer, a young man whose badge read Thompson, took a quick look around, then exchanged a glance with his partner. "Did you get a good look at them, or their bikes?" "I got more than a good look," Jessica replied calmly. "You're looking for Mick Sanders and his crew. They're part of the Thunder Jackals." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "You know them?" Jessica met his gaze, her voice steady. "Let's just say we've crossed paths. They're the ones you'll want to question about the damage around here." The officers exchanged another glance, clearly noting her confidence and lack of fear. "All right," Thompson said, jotting notes into a small pad. "We'll file a report and pass it on to the sheriff, but, if you don't mind me asking, how'd you manage to scare them off?" Jessica tilted her head slightly, the barest hint of a smile playing on her lips. "I didn't scare them. They just realized they were outmatched." By the time the officers left, the motel manager had emerged, pacing anxiously around the parking lot and muttering about broken windows and potential lawsuits. Jessica gave him a brief apology, handed over some cash to cover the damages, and disappeared back into her room. As she sat on the edge of the bed, her mind began to calculate the next steps. She knew the type of man Mick Sanders was. He wouldn't take this lying down. His pride was too bruised, and his gang relied too heavily on the fear he instilled in others. He'd come back, and next time, he wouldn't just bring bats and chains. He'd bring the full weight of his ego-fueled rage. Jessica reached for her satellite phone and dialed a number. "Yeah?" came a gruff voice on the other end. "It's Kane," she said simply. "I need intel on Mick Sanders and the Thunder Jackals. Everything you can get me. Criminal records, associates, known hangouts? There was a pause. You got it. Give me a few hours. Jessica hung up and leaned back against the headboard, her eyes closing briefly. Her training from her time as a Force Recon Marine kicked in, the old instincts sharp as ever. Preparation was everything, and she wasn't about to let her guard down. Miles away, at a rundown bar on the outskirts of town, Mick Sanders was nursing his bruised ego along with his fourth beer. His gang sat around him, some nursing injuries of their own, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm telling you, Mick," Lance said quietly, leaning forward from his seat at the bar. "We can't go at her again. She's not just some random woman. She knew what she was doing." Mick slammed his bottle down on the counter, making everyone flinch. "Shut it, Lance! I don't need you telling me how to handle this." Lance hesitated, but then pressed on. "Think about it. She disarmed all of us without breaking a sweat. And then the cops showed up out of nowhere. She's not just tough. She's connected." "She's nothing," Mick snarled, his voice venomous. "Just another wannabe tough girl who got lucky. Next time, I'll put her in her place." One of the younger bikers, a wiry guy named Pete, spoke up hesitantly. "What if she's ex-military or something? She moved like a pro, Mick. We're not equipped for that kind of fight." Mick's eyes narrowed, his frustration boiling over. "I don't care who she is. No one humiliates me like that." He stood abruptly, pointing a finger at his crew. "You're either with me or you're out. We're paying her another visit tomorrow, and this time, we're ending it." The room fell silent. Some nodded reluctantly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Lance said nothing, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Jessica's phone buzzed just as the first rays of morning sunlight crept through the curtains. She answered immediately. "It's me," the voice on the other end said. "Got what you asked for. Mick Sanders, mid-level thug with a laundry list of petty crimes. Assault, vandalism, extortion. Nothing major, but enough to keep him out of trouble with the bigger players. His gang's small but dangerous, around 15 members total, most of them local misfits." Jessica frowned slightly. "Any affiliations?" "None worth noting. They're not connected to any major crime networks, but they've made plenty of enemies. My guess? Mick's trying to prove himself. He's got something to prove, and you're the wrong person to get in his way." Jessica nodded to herself. "What about their location?" "They're holed up at the Iron Horn, an old bar about 10 miles out of town. That's their base. They've been quiet since last night, but my guess is they're gearing up for something. Be careful." "Always," Jessica replied, ending the call. She stood, stretching out the stiffness from the night before, and began gathering her gear. If Mick and his crew were planning another move, she wasn't going to sit around waiting for it. By mid-morning, Jessica was parked a short distance from the Iron Horn, her SUV tucked behind a row of overgrown shrubs. She watched the bar through a pair of binoculars, noting the bikes parked out front and the few gang members lingering near the entrance. Mick wasn't there yet, but she recognized Lance, the quiet one from the night before. Jessica's instincts told her Lance wasn't fully on board with Mick's plans. He'd been hesitant, almost reluctant, during the encounter at the motel. If there was a way to de-escalate this situation, Lance might be the key. Jessica stepped out of the SUV, her movements quiet and deliberate, and approached the bar from the side. She waited until Lance was alone, stepping around the corner to intercept him as he leaned against the wall, smoking a cigarette. "Lance," she said, her voice calm but firm. He jumped, startled, dropping his cigarette. His eyes widened as he recognized her. "You? How the hell?" "Relax," Jessica said, raising a hand. "I'm not here to fight." Lance hesitated, his eyes darting toward the bar. "If Mick sees you—" "He won't," Jessica interrupted. "Not if you don't tell him. I'm here to talk." Lance swallowed hard, his nerves obvious. "What do you want?" "To end this," Jessica said simply. "Mick's pride is going to get someone killed. Probably you or one of the others. Is that what you want?" Lance shook his head quickly. "Of course not. But Mick, he's not going to back down. You humiliated him. He's already planning to come after you again." Jessica's expression hardened. "Then help me stop him before he does something he can't take back." Lance hesitated, clearly torn. He glanced back toward the bar, then back at Jessica. "You don't know Mick. He doesn't let things go." Jessica stepped closer, her gaze steady. "And I don't let bullies hurt people without consequences. You've seen what I can do. You know I'm not bluffing." Lance sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want me to do?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smile. "Let's start by having a little chat." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but Jessica knew the game was far from over. Mick was dangerous, but his recklessness made him predictable. The question now was whether Lance would help her or betray her. Either way, she was ready. For Jessica, this wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. No matter how big the threat, she wasn't backing down. The midday heat bore down on the cracked pavement outside the Iron Horn as Jessica and Lance stood in the shadow of the bar. Lance's face was pale, his uncertainty clear as he shifted from foot to foot, glancing back toward the door every few seconds. "You're asking me to betray Mick," Lance muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jessica folded her arms, her expression firm but calm. "I'm asking you to stop him from making a mistake that could ruin all of your lives. If he comes for me again, this doesn't end well for any of you." Lance ran a hand through his unkempt hair, glancing nervously at the row of motorcycles lined up near the entrance. "You don't get it. Mick, he's not just my boss. He took me in when I had nothing. He's like family." Jessica's gaze softened slightly. "I get that. But ask yourself, what kind of family drags you into a fight you can't win? What happens when Mick's pride goes too far and someone gets seriously hurt? You've already seen what I'm capable of. Do you think Mick has your back, or does he just want to save face?" Lance didn't answer immediately. His shoulders sagged as he let out a long breath. "So, what's your plan?" Jessica's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "We're going to give Mick what he wants, a showdown, but on my terms." By late afternoon, Lance had slipped back inside the bar, feeding Mick and the others the story Jessica had carefully crafted. "She wants to meet," Lance said, trying to sound reluctant. "Said she's not running. If you've got the guts, she'll be waiting tonight at the old rail yard outside of town." Mick's grin widened, his ego swelling with the thought of finally cornering Jessica on his turf. She finally realized who's in charge. Good. Let's show her what happens when you mess with the Thunder Jackals. The gang cheered, their earlier doubts drowned in the promise of revenge. Mick barked orders, telling his men to gear up and bring everything they had. Tonight would be the night they reclaimed their reputation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Jessica prepared the rail yard for what was to come. The abandoned site, overgrown with weeds and littered with rusting freight cars, provided the perfect setting for what she had in mind. She had positioned herself near the old maintenance shed, a vantage point that gave her a clear view of the yard. With her gear carefully laid out, tactical flashlights, a stun gun, and her pistol, Jessica double-checked every angle, ensuring the field was hers to control. The sound of approaching engines broke the silence, the rumble growing louder as Mick and his crew arrived. Jessica's sharp eyes picked out their figures as they dismounted and began spreading out, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. "All right, lady," Mick called, his voice echoing through the rail yard. "You wanted this, so come out and face me." Jessica didn't answer. She stayed hidden, watching as the bikers moved further into the yard. They were loud, cocky, and uncoordinated, exactly what she had expected. Mick's patience quickly wore thin. "Come on out," he barked. "Or are you scared now?" Still no response. "Spread out," Mick ordered, his frustration mounting. "Find her!" The gang fanned out, their movements sloppy as they searched the shadows. One by one, Jessica picked them off, not with violence, but with precision. The first man turned a corner near the freight cars, only to find himself blinded by a tactical flashlight aimed directly at his eyes. He stumbled back, cursing, before a sharp kick to the back of his knee sent him crumpling to the ground. By the time he regained his senses, Jessica had vanished into the darkness. The second and third fell victim to similar tactics. Disoriented by sudden flashes of light, tripped by carefully placed traps, and left scrambling in confusion. By the time Mick realized his men were dropping like flies, his anger had boiled over into outright fury. "Stop playing games!" he shouted, his voice bouncing off the metal walls of the freight cars. Jessica finally stepped into view, her calm figure illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. She stood on top of one of the freight cars, looking down at Mick with an air of authority that sent a chill through his spine. "You wanted a fight," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "Here I am." Mick raised his bat, his grip tightening. "You think you can take me?" Jessica's lips curved into a faint smirk. "I think you already know the answer to that." With a roar, Mick charged, his bat raised high. Jessica leapt down from the freight car, her movements fluid and precise. She sidestepped his swing easily, delivering a sharp elbow to his ribs that made him stumble. Mick recovered quickly, swinging again, but Jessica ducked under the blow, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The bat clattered to the ground as Mick cried out in pain. "You don't listen, do you?" Jessica said coldly, twisting his arm further until he dropped to his knees. Behind them, the remaining bikers hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. Lance stepped forward, his face torn with conflict. "Mick, it's over!" Lance shouted. Mick glared at him, his pride refusing to admit defeat. "No, she doesn't get to win." Jessica released Mick's arm, shoving him back with a force that sent him sprawling. She stepped back, her gaze shifting to the rest of the gang. "This is your leader?" she asked, her voice sharp. "A man who drags you into fights you can't win, just to feed his ego." The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence crumbling under the weight of her words. "I've faced men like him before," Jessica continued. "They don't care about you. They care about control, about looking strong, even if it means dragging everyone down with them." Lance looked at Mick, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he saw the truth in Jessica's words. Mick wasn't looking out for them. He was using them. "Mick," Lance said quietly, stepping back, "I'm done." The others hesitated, then followed Lance's lead, dropping their weapons and stepping away from Mick. Mick's eyes blazed with fury. "You cowards!" he shouted. "You're all useless!" Jessica stepped closer to him, her voice low. "It's over, Mick. Walk away." For a moment, Mick seemed ready to lunge at her again, but the sound of distant sirens froze him in place. The gang's earlier chaos had drawn attention, and the police were on their way. Jessica stepped back, watching as Mick scrambled to his feet, his fury turning to desperation. "This isn't over," he spat, before turning and running toward his bike. The gang watched him go, their faces filled with a mix of relief and shame. Lance turned to Jessica, his expression serious. "What now?" he asked. Jessica regarded him for a moment, then said, "That's up to you. You don't have to follow him anymore. You're better than this." Lance nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. As the sirens grew louder, Jessica turned and disappeared into the shadows of the rail yard. For Mick, the fight was far from over. But for Lance and the others, it was the beginning of a chance to break free from the cycle of violence. Jessica Kane had sent her message loud and clear. The days of unchecked arrogance were over, and she wasn't done yet. The faint glow of dawn crept across the horizon, bathing the rail yard in muted gold as the police cars finally rolled in. Officers stepped cautiously through the scene, finding the battered gang members who had stayed behind, some nursing bruises, others staring blankly at the ground. The tension in the air was palpable as questions were asked and half-hearted answers were mumbled. Lance sat near one of the rusted freight cars, his shoulders slumped, a heavy weight in his chest. Jessica's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't have to follow him anymore." He knew she was right. Mick had always been about power and control, never about loyalty. Lance had seen it before. In the small ways Mick sacrificed his men's safety for his own pride, but it had taken Jessica, a stranger, to finally make him see it clearly. An officer approached him. "You one of them?" Lance looked up, his expression resigned. "Not anymore." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "You'd better come with us." Lance didn't resist as the officer guided him toward the patrol cars. He knew he had choices to make, and staying silent wasn't one of them anymore. Jessica watched from a distance as the police rounded up the bikers who hadn't fled with Mick. She stayed hidden among the shadows of the rail yard, her sharp eyes scanning the scene for any sign of Mick himself. But he was long gone, his retreating motorcycle a bitter reminder that the real threat had slipped through her fingers. She adjusted her jacket and made her way back to her SUV, which was parked just beyond the outskirts of the rail yard. Her phone buzzed as she reached for the door. It was a text from her contact. "Good work. Cops cleaned up. Need anything else?" Jessica typed a quick reply. "Mick's still out there. Dig deeper. I want his entire operation." As she started the engine, her mind raced. Mick wouldn't take this loss quietly. Men like him never did. If anything, his humiliation would push him to escalate, and that made him even more dangerous. Mick paced furiously inside an old garage hidden deep in the woods outside of town. His makeshift hideout was filled with rusted tools, beer cans, and the acrid smell of gasoline. He had abandoned the rest of his crew, the ones who hadn't already turned on him, and was now surrounded by a handful of his most loyal and most desperate men. Pete, a wiry man with a nervous energy, spoke hesitantly. "Mick, maybe we should let this go. She's not just some diner lady. She's trained, man. We don't know what she's capable of." Mick rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "What she's capable of? What about us, huh? Are we just going to roll over and let her win? She humiliated us, humiliated me." Pete flinched, but didn't respond. The other men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Mick slammed his fist onto a workbench, scattering a pile of tools. "No, this isn't over. We're not just going to sit here and lick our wounds. We're going to hit her back. Hard." "How?" another man asked cautiously. Mick's face twisted into a dangerous grin. "We find out where she is. We find out who she cares about. And we make her regret ever crossing us." Back at the motel, Jessica sat at the small desk in her room, scrolling through the data her contact had sent over. Mick's operation was more extensive than she'd originally thought. While his gang wasn't large, they were tied to several petty crime rings in the area: illegal gambling, stolen goods, and even a few links to arms trafficking. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she considered her options. Mick was dangerous, but he wasn't untouchable. She could go straight to the authorities with the information she had, but that wouldn't stop him from retaliating. She needed to neutralize the threat entirely, and that meant cutting off his resources and support. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jessica tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath the desk. She approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. It was Lance. She opened the door a crack, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Lance held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I need to talk." Jessica studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Lance entered slowly, his posture tense but non-threatening. "I told the cops everything," he said, his voice low. "About Mick, about the gang, about everything we've done." Jessica leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And they're going to come after him," Lance continued. "But I don't think it'll be enough. Mick's not just going to sit around and wait to get caught. He's already talking about going after you." Jessica's jaw tightened. She had expected as much. Lance hesitated before speaking again. "I want to help." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Lance's shoulders slumped slightly. "Because you're right. Mick doesn't care about us. He never did. And if he's not stopped, more people are going to get hurt." Jessica studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "All right," she said after a moment. "You want to help? Then tell me everything you know about where Mick might be hiding." By late afternoon, Jessica and Lance were on the move, driving toward an old industrial park that Lance had mentioned as one of Mick's fallback spots. The drive was tense, the silence between them broken only by Lance's occasional directions. "You really think we can stop him?" Lance asked finally, his voice uncertain. Jessica kept her eyes on the road. "We're not stopping him. We're making sure he can't hurt anyone else again." As they pulled into the industrial park, Jessica parked the SUV behind a row of crumbling buildings. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of wind and the distant hum of traffic. Lance pointed toward a large warehouse at the far end of the lot. "If he's here, that's where he'll be." Jessica nodded, her mind already mapping out the approach. "Stay here," she said firmly. "If things go south, I don't need you in the crossfire." "But no arguments," Jessica said, cutting him off. "Stay." Lance reluctantly nodded, watching as Jessica disappeared into the shadows. The warehouse was dimly lit, its interior a maze of rusting machinery and stacked crates. Jessica moved silently, her steps calculated and her senses sharp. She heard voices before she saw them, Mick's unmistakable growl, followed by the nervous murmurs of his remaining crew. "She's dead the next time I see her," Mick snarled. "I don't care what it takes." Jessica stepped into view, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You won't get that chance." Mick spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You've got guts, lady, I'll give you that, but this time you're outnumbered." Jessica's gaze swept over the room. There were 4 men with Mick, all armed, but their stances betrayed their nervousness. "I don't need numbers," Jessica said calmly. "I just need you to know one thing. This ends here." Mick laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Big words for someone who's about to lose." Jessica didn't respond. She moved. The fight was brutal and swift, her training evident in every calculated strike. She disarmed the first man with ease, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of crates. The second lunged at her with a crowbar, but she ducked under the swing, landing a precise blow to his jaw. Mick watched, his confidence fading as his men fell one by one. Finally, it was just the 2 of them. "You should have stayed out of this," Mick growled, pulling a knife from his belt. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "So should you." The final clash was short but decisive. Jessica's movements were fluid and controlled, her experience overwhelming Mick's brute strength. Within moments, he was disarmed and on the ground, gasping for breath. Jessica stood over him, her voice cold. "It's over." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Mick's defiance crumbled. For the first time he realized he'd lost, and Jessica knew the fight, for now, was done. The faint glow of dawn crept across the horizon, bathing the rail yard in muted gold as the police cars finally rolled in. Officers stepped cautiously through the scene, finding the battered gang members who had stayed behind, some nursing bruises, others staring blankly at the ground. The tension in the air was palpable as questions were asked and half-hearted answers were mumbled. Lance sat near one of the rusted freight cars, his shoulders slumped, a heavy weight in his chest. Jessica's words still echoed in his mind. "You don't have to follow him anymore." He knew she was right. Mick had always been about power and control, never about loyalty. Lance had seen it before. In the small ways Mick sacrificed his men's safety for his own pride. But it had taken Jessica, a stranger, to finally make him see it clearly. An officer approached him. "You one of them?" Lance looked up, his expression resigned. "Not anymore." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press. "You'd better come with us." Lance didn't resist as the officer guided him toward the patrol cars. He knew he had choices to make, and staying silent wasn't one of them anymore. Jessica watched from a distance as the police rounded up the bikers who hadn't fled with Mick. She stayed hidden among the shadows of the rail yard, her sharp eyes scanning the scene for any sign of Mick himself. But he was long gone, his retreating motorcycle a bitter reminder that the real threat had slipped through her fingers. She adjusted her jacket and made her way back to her SUV, which was parked just beyond the outskirts of the rail yard. Her phone buzzed as she reached for the door. It was a text from her contact. "Good work. Cops cleaned up. Need anything else?" Jessica typed a quick reply. "Mick's still out there. Dig deeper. I want his entire operation." As she started the engine, her mind raced. Mick wouldn't take this loss quietly. Men like him never did. If anything, his humiliation would push him to escalate, and that made him even more dangerous. Mick paced furiously inside an old garage hidden deep in the woods outside of town. His makeshift hideout was filled with rusted tools, beer cans, and the acrid smell of gasoline. He had abandoned the rest of his crew, the ones who hadn't already turned on him, and was now surrounded by a handful of his most loyal and most desperate men. Pete, a wiry man with a nervous energy, spoke hesitantly. "Mick, maybe we should let this go. She's not just some diner lady. She's trained, man. We don't know what she's capable of." Mick rounded on him, his eyes blazing. "What she's capable of? What about us, huh? Are we just going to roll over and let her win? She humiliated us, humiliated me." Pete flinched but didn't respond. The other men exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. Mick slammed his fist onto a workbench, scattering a pile of tools. "No, this isn't over. We're not just going to sit here and lick our wounds. We're going to hit her back. Hard." "How?" another man asked cautiously. Mick's face twisted into a dangerous grin. "We find out where she is. We find out who she cares about, and we make her regret ever crossing us." Back at the motel, Jessica sat at the small desk in her room, scrolling through the data her contact had sent over. Mick's operation was more extensive than she'd originally thought. While his gang wasn't large, they were tied to several petty crime rings in the area: illegal gambling, stolen goods, and even a few links to arms trafficking. Her fingers hovered over her phone as she considered her options. Mick was dangerous, but he wasn't untouchable. She could go straight to the authorities with the information she had, but that wouldn't stop him from retaliating. She needed to neutralize the threat entirely, and that meant cutting off his resources and support. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Jessica tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife hidden beneath the desk. She approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. It was Lance. She opened the door a crack, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" Lance held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to fight. I need to talk." Jessica studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. Lance entered slowly, his posture tense but non-threatening. "I told the cops everything," he said, his voice low. "About Mick, about the gang, about everything we've done." Jessica leaned against the wall, arms crossed. And they're going to come after him," Lance continued. "But I don't think it'll be enough. Mick's not just going to sit around and wait to get caught. He's already talking about going after you." Jessica's jaw tightened. She had expected as much. Lance hesitated before speaking again. "I want to help." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Lance's shoulders slumped slightly. "Because you're right. Mick doesn't care about us. He never did. And if he's not stopped, more people are going to get hurt." Jessica studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was a man who had finally reached his breaking point. "All right," she said after a moment. "You want to help? Then tell me everything you know about where Mick might be hiding." By late afternoon, Jessica and Lance were on the move, driving toward an old industrial park that Lance had mentioned as one of Mick's fallback spots. The drive was tense, the silence between them broken only by Lance's occasional directions. "You really think we can stop him?" Lance asked finally, his voice uncertain. Jessica kept her eyes on the road. "We're not stopping him. We're making sure he can't hurt anyone else again." As they pulled into the industrial park, Jessica parked the SUV behind a row of crumbling buildings. The area was eerily quiet, the only sounds the rustling of wind and the distant hum of traffic. Lance pointed toward a large warehouse at the far end of the lot. "If he's here, that's where he'll be." Jessica nodded, her mind already mapping out the approach. "Stay here," she said firmly. "If things go south, I don't need you in the crossfire." "But—" "No arguments," Jessica said, cutting him off. "Stay." Lance reluctantly nodded, watching as Jessica disappeared into the shadows. The warehouse was dimly lit, its interior a maze of rusting machinery and stacked crates. Jessica moved silently, her steps calculated and her senses sharp. She heard voices before she saw them, Mick's unmistakable growl, followed by the nervous murmurs of his remaining crew. "She's dead the next time I see her," Mick snarled. "I don't care what it takes." Jessica stepped into view, her voice cutting through the space like a blade. "You won't get that chance." Mick spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her. "You've got guts, lady, I'll give you that, but this time you're outnumbered." Jessica's gaze swept over the room. There were 4 men with Mick, all armed, but their stances betrayed their nervousness. "I don't need numbers," Jessica said calmly. "I just need you to know one thing. This ends here." Mick laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. "Big words for someone who's about to lose." Jessica didn't respond. She moved. The fight was brutal and swift, her training evident in every calculated strike. She disarmed the first man with ease, using his own momentum to send him crashing into a stack of crates. The second lunged at her with a crowbar, but she ducked under the swing, landing a precise blow to his jaw. Mick watched, his confidence fading as his men fell one by one. Finally, it was just the 2 of them. "You should have stayed out of this," Mick growled, pulling a knife from his belt. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "So should you." The final clash was short but decisive. Jessica's movements were fluid and controlled, her experience overwhelming Mick's brute strength. Within moments he was disarmed and on the ground, gasping for breath. Jessica stood over him, her voice cold. "It's over." As the sound of sirens approached in the distance, Mick's defiance crumbled. For the first time he realized he'd lost, and Jessica knew the fight, for now, was done. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the tension-filled silence in the warehouse. Jessica stood over Mick, her breath steady despite the fight she'd just endured. Her calm demeanor only made his humiliation sting more. You think you've won?" Mick spat, struggling to sit up. His voice was weak, but the venom in his words was unmistakable. "This isn't over. I've got people, connections. You don't scare me." Jessica crouched down to his level, her sharp gaze locking onto his. "You're right. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to stop you, and when they drag you away in cuffs, you'll finally realize something. Your connections can't save you from your own arrogance." Mick's defiant glare faltered as the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. Jessica straightened, stepping back just as the warehouse doors burst open, floodlights from police cars illuminating the scene. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them!" Jessica raised her hands slowly, stepping aside to allow the officers to take control. Mick's gang, or what was left of it, didn't resist as they were cuffed and hauled out one by one. Mick himself struggled weakly, shouting curses until an officer silenced him with a warning. Officer Maria Lopez, a seasoned cop with sharp eyes and a commanding presence, approached Jessica, her hand resting on the radio clipped to her shoulder. "Well," Lopez said, surveying the scene, "looks like you had quite the party." Jessica lowered her hands, her expression neutral. It was a necessary cleanup. Lopez's brow arched, but her tone remained professional. "We've been tracking this gang for months. Never thought they'd go down like this. Care to explain how you're involved?" Jessica hesitated for a moment, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a folded card. She handed it to Lopez. "Former Force Recon," Lopez read aloud, her voice tinged with surprise. "That explains a lot." "They targeted me," Jessica said simply. "I made sure they couldn't hurt anyone else." Lopez studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You're lucky we don't charge people for doing our job." Jessica gave a faint smile. "Just trying to help." Lopez tucked the card into her pocket. "Well, you've made a lot of people in this town safer, but this isn't how we usually handle things. Don't make a habit of it." Jessica nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. As the officers escorted Mick and his crew out, Lance emerged from the shadows near the warehouse entrance. He walked slowly toward Jessica, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. "You all right?" he asked hesitantly. Jessica nodded. "I'm fine. What about you?" Lance shrugged, glancing toward Mick as he was shoved into the back of a patrol car. "Feels weird, seeing him like that. For a long time he was everything to the guys. Now, he's just another criminal going to jail." "He was always just another criminal," Jessica said bluntly. "You just didn't see it." Lance winced at the truth of her words, but didn't argue. "What are you going to do now?" Jessica asked after a moment. Lance looked at her, his expression a mix of uncertainty and determination. "Start over, I guess. Maybe get out of town, find something better to do with my life." Jessica's gaze softened. "That's a good choice. You've got a chance to change things. Don't waste it." Lance nodded, a small flicker of hope crossing his face. "Thanks for everything." Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the glow of the police lights. The Riverside Diner was buzzing with activity, a stark contrast to the tense silence of a few days ago. Word had spread quickly about what had happened, how Mick Sanders and his gang had been taken down, and how a mysterious woman had been at the center of it all. Jessica sat in her usual booth, sipping her coffee as the waitress approached, a broad smile on her face. "You're the talk of the town," the waitress said, setting down a fresh plate of toast. "Everyone's saying you're some kind of hero." Jessica shook her head with a faint smile. "Just did what needed to be done." "Well, whatever you did, it worked. People feel safer now. I even heard the sheriff's department is cracking down on the smaller gangs because of this." Jessica glanced out the window, her thoughts already moving to the next step. She wasn't one for the spotlight, but if her actions had sparked real change, then it had all been worth it. The bell above the door jingled, and Officer Lopez walked in, her uniform crisp and her expression sharp. She spotted Jessica immediately and made her way over. "Mind if I join you?" Lopez asked. Jessica gestured to the seat across from her. Lopez sat down, folding her hands on the table. "I thought you'd skip town by now." Jessica sipped her coffee. "Not yet. Wanted to make sure everything settled down first." Lopez nodded, her tone turning serious. "We've got Mick in custody, and with the evidence we've collected, he's not getting out anytime soon. But I get the feeling this isn't the last time we'll see trouble like this." "It never is," Jessica said evenly. Lopez leaned back, studying her. "You're good at what you do, Kane. Too good to just be passing through diners and taking down gangs on your own." Jessica met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I don't work for anyone anymore." "Maybe you should," Lopez said, her tone pointed. "People like you can make a real difference, more than what you did here." Jessica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she finished her coffee, set the cup down, and gave Lopez a small smile. "I'll think about it." Lopez nodded, standing up. "You do that, and if you ever need a way back in, give me a call." She handed Jessica her card and left the diner, the bell jingling softly behind her. Jessica stood on the balcony of her motel room, the setting sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. Her phone buzzed with a new message from her contact. "Mick's network is officially dismantled. Local cops are cleaning up the rest. Good work." Jessica exhaled, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The job was done, at least for now. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that her fight wasn't over. The world was full of men like Mick Sanders, bullies who thrived on fear and control. And while Jessica had left the battlefield behind years ago, the battles had a way of finding her. As she packed her bag and prepared to leave town, Jessica glanced at the card Officer Lopez had given her. She tucked it into her jacket pocket, a small reminder that no matter where she went, there was always work to be done, and Jessica Kane was always ready. The engine of Jessica's SUV hummed softly as she drove along the stretch of highway, the small town of Riverside disappearing in her rearview mirror. The events of the past few days played through her mind, the bikers, the takedown, and the unexpected alliances she had formed. Though she was leaving Riverside behind, she knew her story there wasn't entirely over. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her out of her thoughts. Jessica glanced at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, but her instincts told her it wasn't a random call. She pulled over to the side of the road, picking up the phone cautiously. "This is Kane," she answered. The voice on the other end was calm, authoritative, and familiar. "Jessica Kane, former Force Recon Marine. I've been following your work in Riverside." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "Who's this?" "Let's just say I'm someone who admires results. And you've delivered." Jessica didn't respond, waiting for the stranger to get to the point. I represent a group that handles complicated problems, problems that traditional law enforcement can't or won't solve. Your background and recent actions make you an ideal candidate for what we do." Jessica's voice hardened. "I'm not looking for a job." "That's what you said when you left the Marines," the voice replied smoothly. "But here you are, taking down gangs and protecting small towns. You're not the kind to sit still, Kane, and we both know it." Jessica's jaw tightened. He wasn't wrong. "What's the job?" she asked after a moment, her tone guarded. "A growing criminal network tied to human trafficking. We've been tracking them for months, but they're slippery, dangerous. We need someone on the ground who can get close, disrupt their operations, and pave the way for enforcement to take them out for good." Jessica's mind raced. Human trafficking wasn't something she could ignore. Still, she wasn't about to jump into something blind. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you're effective," the voice said simply, "and because someone like you is exactly what they'd never see coming. Think about it. I'll send the details." The line went dead before Jessica could respond. Jessica sat in her SUV for several minutes, staring at the phone in her hand. She wasn't surprised when a text message came through moments later containing a file with the details of the operation. She opened it, her eyes scanning the names, locations, and faces tied to the network. It was worse than she thought. Smuggling routes, front businesses, even connections to corrupt officials. This wasn't just a local gang. It was a well-organized, multi-state operation with deep pockets and a ruthless reputation. Her stomach churned at the sight of photos showing terrified victims, their faces blurred, but their fear unmistakable. This was the kind of evil she had enlisted in the Marines to fight. Jessica exhaled slowly, her decision already made. She couldn't turn her back on this. The first step was intel. Jessica drove to a nearby city where one of the network's smaller fronts operated, a grimy nightclub on the outskirts of town. She spent the next few nights observing the club from a distance, noting the patterns of the bouncers, the comings and goings of certain patrons, and the subtle signs of illegal activity. The file she'd been given included the name of a low-level enforcer named Rico Alvarez. He wasn't a major player, but he had access to the bigger fish. Jessica's plan was simple: get close to Rico, gain his trust, and use him to climb the ladder. On the fourth night, Jessica made her move. Dressed in a fitted leather jacket and boots, she approached the nightclub with the confidence of someone who belonged. The bouncers gave her a once-over, but didn't stop her as she slipped inside. The club was dark and loud, the pounding bass vibrating through the floor. Jessica moved through the crowd with ease, her sharp eyes scanning the room until she spotted Rico in a corner booth, flanked by two associates. He was laughing loudly, a cigar in one hand and a drink in the other. Jessica approached the bar, ordering a drink but keeping her attention on Rico. She waited until one of his associates got up, leaving a space open at the booth. With her drink in hand, she sauntered over, catching Rico's eye. "You don't look like the kind of guy who drinks alone," she said with a sly smile. Rico looked her over, his curiosity piqued. "And you don't look like the kind of girl who needs company." "Maybe not," Jessica replied, sliding into the open seat. "But I was curious about you." Rico grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. "Well, curiosity's a dangerous thing, sweetheart, but I like your style." Jessica spent the next hour playing her part perfectly. Charming, confident, and just mysterious enough to keep Rico intrigued. By the end of the night, she had learned enough about his operation to know she was on the right track. Over the next few weeks, Jessica worked her way deeper into Rico's circle. She carefully balanced gaining his trust while keeping her cover intact, always staying one step ahead. Her military training came in handy, reading people, adapting to unexpected situations, and maintaining her composure under pressure. But as she climbed higher, the stakes grew deadlier. Rico's boss, a ruthless trafficker named Victor DeLuca, was known for his paranoia and his tendency to eliminate anyone he suspected of betrayal. Jessica knew it was only a matter of time before she attracted his attention. One night, as she sat in a private room with Rico and several other members of the network, her phone buzzed with a message from her contact. "DeLuca's aware of a leak. Be careful." Jessica's blood ran cold. She glanced at Rico, who was laughing at a crude joke one of his men had made. Did he suspect her? Or was DeLuca targeting someone else? Either way, she needed to act fast. The next night, Jessica was called to a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location that immediately set off alarms in her mind. She arrived prepared, concealing a small knife and a backup communication device in her boots. Inside the warehouse, Victor DeLuca waited, flanked by armed guards. His sharp eyes studied Jessica as she entered, his expression cold and unreadable. "Miss Kane," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "I've been hearing things about you." Jessica kept her composure, her voice steady. "Good things, I hope." DeLuca's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's find out." The tension in the room was suffocating as DeLuca gestured for one of his men to step forward. He carried a file, one that Jessica recognized instantly. It was her military record, detailed and damning. "I don't like surprises," DeLuca said, his gaze narrowing. "And you, my dear, are full of them." Jessica's mind raced, but her voice remained calm. "And yet, here I am. If I were a threat, don't you think I'd have done something by now?" DeLuca tilted his head, considering her words. "Perhaps. Or maybe you're just waiting for the right moment." Jessica took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "If you don't trust me, then kill me. But if you do, I can give you something no one else can. Access to networks you haven't even dreamed of." DeLuca's eyes narrowed, his curiosity evident. "You'd better hope you're telling the truth." As Jessica walked out of the warehouse alive, she knew the clock was ticking. The deeper she went, the harder it would be to escape. But she wasn't just there to survive. She was there to dismantle DeLuca's empire from the inside out, and she wasn't leaving until the job was done. Jessica Kane's infiltration of Victor DeLuca's trafficking network was one of precision, grit, and sheer determination. As she climbed deeper into the organization, she gathered critical evidence, risking her life to expose the criminals at the top. Her strategy culminated in a daring operation where she coordinated with law enforcement to stage a massive raid, leading to DeLuca's arrest and the rescue of dozens of victims. For Jessica, the mission wasn't just about taking down a powerful criminal. It was about standing up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Her actions inspired a ripple effect, sparking greater awareness and stronger crackdowns on trafficking operations across the region. But Jessica didn't stick around for recognition. As the dust settled, she quietly disappeared, ready to take on the next challenge, knowing there would always be another battle to fight. Her story wasn't just a testament to bravery. It was a reminder that one person, driven by purpose, can make an extraordinary difference. Jessica's story shows us that courage and determination can lead to extraordinary change. Her fight against injustice reminds us that there are heroes among us, sometimes in the most unexpected places. If you were inspired by her story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of bravery and resilience. Want to support real-life heroes like Jessica? Consider donating to organizations that fight human trafficking and support veterans transitioning to civilian life. Links are in the description below. Thanks for watching, and remember, every small act of courage can lead to something extraordinary. Stay tuned for our next story.